I found someone else. The money is mine. The house is mine. Good luck in that war zone. That was the 17-word message my husband sent me attached to a divorce petition while I was deployed in Afghanistan. But what felt like a hand crushing my heart wasn't the flat zero in our joint savings account, the $38,000 I had bled to save. It was the photo attached below it. A picture of his mistress sitting on my front porch wearing my silk robe and holding Buster in her lap. The beagle that exactly 2 months ago he swore through a sobbing phone call had just been killed by a car. He staged a fake funeral, killed that innocent life in my mind, and psychologically tortured me in the middle of a combat zone 7,000 miles away, just to clear the path for his mistress. He thought the geographical distance and the artillery fire would neutralize me. But he forgot that he was starting a war with a captain in the United States Army. And before I left, I had set a trap. Before we continue, take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you really want to see how this fraud meets his end. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I didn't cry. Crying is a luxury for people who feel safe. Out here, 7,000 miles from home, my brain just bypassed the grief entirely. It triggered the exact same primal survival switch I use when standing over a ruptured aorta on the operating table. Shut off the panic. Clamp the bleeder. Isolate the threat. I slowly pushed the laptop screen down. The sharp plastic click cut through the dead air of the empty MWR tent. Outside, the heavy hum of a diesel generator vibrated through the plywood floorboards, sending a dull, rhythmic rattle up the soles of my combat boots. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. Too steady. Flakes of dried, rust-colored blood from a 19-year-old private were still jammed deep beneath my cuticles. The metallic smell of copper and sweat clung to my skin. I spend my days over here trying to keep American kids from returning home in aluminum transfer cases. And while I do that, the man sharing my bed is back in Tennessee, casually digging my grave with a keyboard. I popped the laptop open again. I didn't look at the image like a betrayed wife. I stripped the emotion out of it. I studied it like an intelligence officer analyzing hostile satellite imagery. Zoom in, analyze, exploit the weaknesses. The floral silk robe clinging to her shoulders. I bought that in Florence during our first anniversary trip. The dark, heavy oak coffee table her bare feet were propped on. I paid for that. 3 straight months of pulling graveyard shifts at the Clarksville ER. Dealing with gunshot wounds, meth overdoses, and domestic assaults, until my bones ached just so Julian could have the rustic aesthetic he wanted for the living room. 38 grand. Do you know how much blood you have to mop off a floor to save 38 grand on an army paycheck? It was years of hazard pay. $225 extra a month for the privilege of getting mortared in your sleep. And he drained it for a girl who looked like she couldn't spell the word deployment. But he wasn't just stealing my cash. This was a calculated territorial display. He was handing the keys of my sanctuary to a stranger to establish dominance, marking his territories over my sweat. But the money was just paper. The robe was just fabric. My eyes locked onto the bottom right corner of the screen. Buster. His tricolor coat was glossy. His tail was caught in a mid-blur wag. His front legs were perfectly intact. No crushed ribs, no tire marks, no internal bleeding from the hit-and-run Julian had described in graphic detail. 2 months ago. The memory hit the back of my skull like a sniper round. Julian's voice over the crackling satellite phone. He was choking on his own tears. The perfect, devastated dog dad. He slipped his collar Nola. The truck didn't even hit the brakes. He died in my arms. I had dropped to my knees in the dirt outside the mess hall that night. I mourned. I dragged myself through every ugly stage of grief in a combat zone. Julian forced me to dig a mental grave for my best friend. He buried me in a depressive hole so pitch black that I stopped asking for video calls. I stopped asking questions entirely. All to give him the operational security he needed to move a blonde parasite into my house. He weaponized a dog's life to break me. The air in the tent suddenly felt too thin. The ringing in my ears started to drown out the diesel generators. I reached up and grabbed the cold metal dog tags hanging around my neck. I squeezed my fists shut. Hard. The aluminum edges bit deeply into the calluses on my palm. The sharp, grounding sting of physical pain pulled me back from the edge. Julian Vance was dead to me. The man I married never existed. He was just a hollow shell feeding off my paycheck. Right at that exact second, the base public address system shrieked. It was a shrill mechanical wail that ripped through the Afghan heat. Code red, medevac inbound, mass casualty event, all available trauma personnel to the surgical bay. The divorce had to wait. I let go of the dog tags, letting them drop heavily against my sternum. I slammed the laptop shut and shoved it into my assault pack. Outside the canvas flap of the tent, the rhythmic heavy chopping of Blackhawk rotors began shaking the dust off the roof. I pushed through the flap into the blinding desert sun. The smell of burning trash, dry earth, and aviation fuel flooded my lungs. I broke into a dead sprint toward the medical tents. Another body was coming in shattered. More blood. More broken bones. I pushed through the swinging doors of the surgical bay. The noise was deafening. Medics shouting over each other, the metallic clatter of surgical instruments hitting steel trays. They wheeled him in. A kid no older than 20, his uniform soaked black with his own blood. His leg was shredded, ruined. I snapped a pair of sterile latex gloves over my calloused hands, walking straight toward the operating table. Looking down at the catastrophic damage to this kid's body, my jaw locked. My mind flashed back to the people I called family. The people who had been bleeding me dry year after year with a smile on their faces. I pressed the number 10 scalpel against the private's shredded thigh. One clean, deep slice. Dark, oxygen-deprived blood welled up, instantly spilling over the blue, sterile drapes. I didn't blink. I just watched it flow. That bleeding. Fast. Unstoppable. It looked exactly like my checking account every time Julian announced his latest startup venture. An artisanal hot sauce company, a craft beer delivery app, a subscription box for raw denim. Every single time he failed, it was always the market's fault. The economy was bad. Investors didn't have vision. He was a self-proclaimed entrepreneur who slept until noon, treating my bank account like an open vein to fund his delusions. He wanted the title. He wanted the LinkedIn bio. He wanted to sit at the bar in East Nashville, swirling a $12 bourbon, talking about disrupting the industry. And I was just the silent ATM pumping blood into that fake shell of a man so he wouldn't have to get a real job. Hemostat. I held my hand out. The scrub tech slapped the cold steel instrument into my palm. I dug into the ruined muscle, found the severed artery, and clamped down hard. The bleeding stopped. Clamp down. Restrict. Control. Just like Sylvia. My mind snapped back to last Christmas in Tennessee. The Vance family dining room. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of cheap vanilla candles and roasted meat. Julian's mother, Sylvia, slid a heavy hardback Southern cookbook across the table. It bumped against my wine glass. I looked down at the cover, then up at her. She offered me this serene, condescending smile, the kind of smile reserved for a slightly slow child. A woman's real duty is keeping the fire burning at home. Nola, Sylvia said. Her voice dripped with fake sugary concern. Julian needs a wife, not a roommate, who works 80 hours a week. She said that while actively chewing a bite of prime ribeye steak. A steak that I bought, using the credit card she knew damn well was in my name, because her son's credit score was a joke. I sat there gripping my fork under the table until my knuckles went white, listening to a woman who hadn't worked a day since 1985 tell me I wasn't doing enough. Right after she swallowed my food, Julian tore into his present. The tearing paper sounded like a dry cough in the quiet room. He ripped the box open. A brand new set of limited edition Callaway golf clubs gleamed under the chandelier. He pulled the driver out, taking a practice swing right there in the living room, nearly knocking over a lamp. He laughed, flashing that perfect, expensive smile. Thanks for supporting my passion, babe, he grinned. The whole room clapped. Marcus, his father, sat at the head of the table, nodding with deep, patriarchal pride. That's right, son. You need to decompress. Being a businessman is stressful. Marcus grunted, raising his glass. I stared at the golf clubs. 3 months. That leather bag and those titanium heads cost the equivalent of 3 straight months of my residency salary. 3 months of sleeping in my car between shifts, eating cold vending machine sandwiches, and smelling like hospital bleach. And his father was clapping. They didn't see me as a person, they saw me as a utility, a machine that produced money and prestige for their golden boy. Suits, I demanded, snapping back to the operating table. I took the needle driver, pierced the tissue, pulled the heavy suture thread through the muscle wall, tied the knot. I snipped the end of the thread. A clean cut. That cutting motion dragged up the ugliest memory of all, the one that finally showed me who Julian really was. He didn't just steal from me. 2 years ago, he secretly convinced my parents to invest $20,000 of their retirement fund into a real estate flip, a ghost project that never existed. I only found out when I was doing the taxes and stumbled across the dealership invoice. 20 grand, gone. Not into a house, in a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro, a vintage gas-guzzling toy he parked in our driveway. I confronted him in the kitchen. I threw the invoice on the granite counter. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely speak. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He just leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, looking at me like I was overreacting to a spilled glass of milk. Technically, that money is your inheritance anyway. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. Just consider it an early advance. He stole from my aging parents. He robbed them of their security, and he justified it by acting like my parents were already dead. These people weren't just parasites. They were locusts. They wanted to strip me down to the bone. They wanted to consume my roots, my money, my pride, and leave me as an empty husk. I tied the final knot on the private's leg, snapped the scissors. If you've ever had a toxic in-law look down on you while spending your hard-earned money, hit the like button right now. And do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me exactly what percentage your phone battery is at while listening to this. Let's see how many of us are wide awake right now. I tossed the bloody instruments onto the metal tray. The surgery was clean. The kid was going to keep his leg. I took a deep, ragged breath, finally feeling the adrenaline start to crash. Then the heart rate monitor next to the table let out a sharp, continuous scream. Beep! The private's chest stopped moving. The green line on the screen went flat. Clear. The heavy thump of the defibrillator paddles jerked the 19-year-old private's chest off the steel operating table. His blood-soaked uniform slapped loudly against the metal. Nothing. Just the solid, high-pitched scream of the heart monitor. I charged the paddles again. I locked my elbows, pressing down hard on his sternum. Clear. Another violent jolt. A heavy second of dead silence in the room. Then a staggered beep. A pause. Another beep. The green line on the screen spiked, dipped, and stabilized into a steady rhythm. He was staying. I peeled off my sterile gloves. The latex snapped sharply against my wrists. I dumped them into the red biohazard bin, pushed open the heavy tent flaps, and stepped out into the blinding Afghan sun. The air out here tasted like burning trash and diesel fuel. It coated the back of my throat. I leaned hard against a stack of sandbags, pulling in a deep drag of the dry, polluted heat. $38,000. The number flashed behind my eyes again. For a guy sitting in a corner office, that is a decent quarterly bonus. For Julian, it was free cash to fund his lazy lifestyle and buy overpriced drinks for a blonde in a downtown Nashville bar. But for me, I looked down at my combat boots. They were caked in yellow desert dust and fresh blood. That money was not just currency. It was hostile fire pay. $225 a month. That is the exact dollar amount the United States government determined my life was worth every 30 days I spent dodging shrapnel in a war zone. It was the price of sleeping in a concrete bunker staring at the ceiling while rocket warning sirens wailed through the night. It was the price of picking gravel and bone fragments out of kids who were barely old enough to buy a lottery ticket. I traded my safety, my sanity, and my own blood for every single cent of that $38,000. And Julian stole it. He stripped my sacrifice down to nothing so he could play the role of a big shot back home. I pushed off the sandbags. I walked back inside, heading straight for the surgical recovery ward. The room was dim, smelling heavily of iodine bleach and stale sweat. I stopped at the private's cot. The anesthesia was wearing off. His eyelids fluttered. Then the panic hit him. His chest heaved. His eyes snapped open, blown out with pure, unfiltered terror. He tried to sit up, groaning against the heavy plastic tube taped to his mouth. His head jerked down toward the bottom of the bed. He was staring at the flat white sheet covering his lower half. The fabric was too flat, too empty. He thought his legs were gone. He was drowning in a wave of absolute horror. I stepped directly into his line of sight. I reached out and clamped my bare hand down firmly on his forehead. My skin still carried the sharp chemical reek of surgical scrub. I did not give him a soft, motherly smile. I gave him the hard, grounded look of an army captain. "Settle down, Private," I ordered. My voice was low, flat, and absolute. "Stop moving. Look at me." His breathing hitched, his eyes locked onto mine. "They are still there," I told him, pressing my hand a fraction harder against his skin to ground him. "The bone is pinned. The artery is grafted. You get to keep your legs. You're going to walk on American soil again. You hear me?" A heavy, wet tear spilled out of the corner of the kid's eye. It cut a clean track through the dirt and gunpowder residue on his cheek. He swallowed hard. His right arm, purple and badly bruised from 3 different IV lines, trembled as he reached up. He did not say a word. He just grabbed a fistful of my blood-stained scrub sleeve and held on. His grip was weak, barely enough to crease the fabric, but he held on like I was the only solid thing left in the universe. I stood there in the dim light of the tent, looking down at his knuckles. Something snapped into place inside my chest. A heavy, ironclad realization. I pulled people out of the dark. I took shattered, broken human beings, and I bolted them back together. I held the line between life and a body bag. Julian Vance. He was a leech, a lazy, entitled parasite who could not even change a flat tire on his own car without calling his father for advice. He spent his days sitting on a couch I bought, spending money I bled for, trying to shrink me down so he could feel like a man. He had no jurisdiction over my worth. Neither did his manipulative mother or his enabling father. They were small, pathetic people playing house with my money. I was out here holding actual life in my hands. They were nothing. They were dust. The canvas door flap scraped open. Sergeant Miller walked in. Miller was a career combat medic. His face looked like a worn-out leather boot lined with deep scars and permanent exhaustion. He walked over to the cot, checked the private's vitals on the monitor, and nodded in approval. Then he turned to me. He shoved a beat-up insulated metal thermos cup into my hands. "Drink it," Miller grunted. The coffee was black, sludgy, and scalding hot. The heat burned straight through the cheap metal, searing the calluses on my palms. It felt good. It felt real. Miller crossed his thick arms over his chest, studying my face. He had seen me staring at the laptop earlier. In a camp this small, you cannot hide a war face. "The real fight is right here, Captain." Miller said, his voice a low gravel rasp. "Do not let those bottom feeders back home drag you down into the mud. You hold the line here. We have got your 6. I took a slow, bitter swallow of the coffee. It tasted like ash and cheap roast. "They cannot drag me down, Sergeant," I said quietly, staring over the rim of the cup. I already rigged the floor to collapse. I handed the cup back to Miller, turned on my heel, and walked out of the medical ward. I headed straight back to my sleeping quarters. It was a narrow, cramped space, reeking of hot canvas and old boots. I dropped to my knees on the plywood floor and reached under the metal frame of my cot. My fingers hooked the handle of my heavy aluminum footlocker. I dragged it out. The metal scraped harshly against the wood. I punched in the 3-digit code on the brass padlock. It popped open with a sharp click. I tossed the lid back. Past the spare combat uniforms, past the extra tourniquets, and the heavy boxes of 9mm ammunition, there was a thick brown manila folder. I pulled it out, feeling the heavy weight of the legal documents inside. Julian thought he played a brilliant hand. He thought he took my money and my home. He thought he won. But he was standing on a landmine, and I was holding the detonator. 800 hours. The air conditioning unit in the corner of the JAG office rattled, a steady mechanical hum that sounded like loose fan blades chopping through dry air. It was a suffocating metallic sound. I sat rigid in the folding metal chair, spine straight, shoulders locked. I didn't come here to cry. I didn't come here to ask for a shoulder to lean on. I came here to drop a bomb. Major Evelyn Grant sat across the scarred wooden desk. She had the kind of eyes that could strip paint off a wall. 20 years in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. She had seen every shade of human garbage the world had to offer. She did not do sympathy. Good. Neither did I. I dropped the heavy manila folder on the desk. The thick paper made a flat, heavy thud against the wood. I opened it. I didn't speak. I just started sliding documents across the scratched surface, snapping them down like playing cards. Exhibit A, the bank statements, joint account ending in 4409, balance 0. Exhibit B, the divorce petition, filed in Davidson County, Tennessee. Exhibit C, the photograph, the blonde sitting on my front porch, my silk robe, and Buster, alive, healthy, and completely unharmed. He drained $38,000 in 48 hours, I said. My voice was completely flat, cold iron. He filed for divorce while I am deployed in a combat zone, and he faked the death of my dog 2 months ago to prevent me from communicating with the home front. Major Grant didn't blink. She reached out and picked up the photograph. Her eyes scanned the glossy paper. The corners of her mouth pulled down into a tight, ugly sneer. She wasn't looking at a man making a mistake. She was looking at a cockroach scurrying across her kitchen floor. Financial abuse among deployed soldiers is a damn epidemic, Grant said. Her voice sounded like grinding gravel. Spouses draining accounts, buying cars, funding their little side pieces while our people are getting shot at. We see it every day. She dropped the photo back onto the desk. She tapped her index finger directly on Buster's face. The tap sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. But this fabricating the death of a family pet to inflict psychological trauma on a deployed officer. Grant leaned back, folding her arms over her chest. That is sick. That is calculated emotional sabotage from a coward who knows you can't punch him in the teeth. She looked up at me. The predatory gleam in her eyes matched exactly what was burning in my chest. He thought he was just screwing over his wife, Grant said softly, but he picked a fight with an army captain in a hostile fire zone. Which means that idiot just declared war on the Pentagon. I reached into the folder one last time. There is a cold, hollow space that opens up in your chest when you realize you have to build a legal fortress to protect yourself from the man sleeping next to you. I felt that chill 3 years ago. I saw the absolute arrogant entitlement in Julian's eyes when he blew my parents' retirement money on a muscle car. I knew this day was coming. I just didn't know when he would finally show his true face. I pulled out a single thick document bound with a blue legal cover. I slid it across the desk. What is this? Grant asked, picking it up. 3 years ago, I hired a private civilian attorney in Nashville, I said. I paid him in cash. I established an irrevocable trust, the deed to the house he is currently living in. It belongs to the trust. The vehicle he drives owned by the trust. Grant's eyes widened a fraction as she scanned the dense legal jargon on the page. My actual combat pay and my residency salary go directly into a shadow account protected by that trust. I continued, keeping my tone dead level. Julian never had access to it. He never even knew it existed. Grant looked up from the paper. Then what was the 38,000 keyed? Bait, I said. The word hung in the air, cold, absolute. Unforgiving. I left that money in the joint account specifically to see what he would do while I was gone. I handed him a loaded gun to see if he would pull the trigger. I stared at the photo of Julian's mistress wearing my clothes. And he just put the barrel in his own mouth. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Major Grant's face. It was the smile of a butcher admiring a sharp cleaver. Captain Downs, Grant murmured, shaking her head slowly. You are a damn artist. She turned to her computer. Her fingers hammered the keyboard with heavy, violent strikes. I am invoking the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Right now, Grant stated. The SCRA protects active duty military from civil actions. His divorce petition suspended indefinitely. He cannot touch your assets. He He cannot sell your property, and he sure as hell cannot finalize a divorce without you standing in that courtroom. She hit the enter key hard enough to rattle the monitor on the desk. Asset freeze authorized, she said, reading the screen. The order is bouncing straight to the domestic banking network. Every credit card with your name on it, every joint account, frozen, locked down tight. The steel trap just snapped shut. Julian wanted to play the high-rolling businessman. He wanted to parade around my house and play king of the castle. Now he was about to find out what happens when you cut the oxygen line. He had zero income. The house wasn't his. The money was locked. The hunter was about to wake up in a cage. "Thank you, Major," I said. I stood up, pushing the metal chair back. I walked out of the JAG tent into the blazing Afghan sunlight. The heat instantly pressed down on my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. I reached into my cargo pocket and pulled out my heavy satellite phone. Just as I looked at the black screen, it lit up. The asset freeze had only been active for 3 minutes. Domestic banks move fast when the federal government barks. The phone buzzed aggressively against my calloused palm. Incoming call. The caller ID glowed bright against the harsh glare of the sun. Sylvia Vance. The rats just smelled the smoke. 20 minutes before the heavy satellite phone buzzed in my hand, I had been sitting on the edge of my canvas cot, staring at the 17 words Julian sent me. I found someone else. The money is mine. The house is mine. Good luck in that war zone. I did not scream. I did not throw the laptop against the corrugated steel wall of the barracks. When a hostile force reveals their position, you do not make noise. You adjust your optics. I opened a blank reply window. I did not write a paragraph demanding explanations. I did not ask him how he could do this to me. Narcissists feed on your emotional bleeding. They want you to beg. They want you to lose your mind so they can show their friends the messages and call you crazy. I starved him. I placed my fingers on the plastic keys and typed exactly 5 words. "Are you sure about that?" I hit send. Then I closed the laptop. The absolute deafening silence on my end was a psychological landmine. I knew he was sitting in my living room in Tennessee, staring at the screen, waiting for me to explode. But the explosion did not come. Instead, the domestic banking grid slammed its iron doors shut on him. Now standing outside the JAG office in the blinding Afghan sun, I stared at the glowing caller ID on my satellite phone. Sylvia Vance. The asset freeze was live. The rats were trapped in the maze, and they were finally smelling the smoke. I pressed the green button and lifted the thick, heavy plastic to my ear. I did not say, "Hello." "What the hell are you doing?" Sylvia's voice shrieked through the static of the satellite connection. She was breathing hard, taking shallow, frantic gasps like she had just sprinted up a flight of stairs. The background noise on her end sounded like a grocery store parking lot. Julian's credit cards just declined at the register, both of them. She yelled, her pitch climbing higher, scraping against my eardrum. The bank teller told him the accounts are locked by a federal hold, and Chloe's landlord just threatened to kick her out because her security deposit check bounced. One. I stood completely still. The hot desert wind whipped a layer of fine yellow sand against my combat boots. I listened to the absolute panic of a woman realizing her golden boy was entirely broke. "Unlock the accounts right now, Nola," Sylvia demanded. Her tone shifted, trying to mask her panic with that fake, authoritative mother-in-law voice she always used on me. "You are being petty. Julian is under a lot of stress. You cannot just cut him off and leave them on the street." I stared out at the concrete blast walls surrounding the compound. "Did you just ask me?" I said, my voice dropping to a dead flat calm. "To pay for your son's mistress to buy groceries." "She is pregnant, Nola," Sylvia cried out. She weaponized the words, throwing them like a desperate grenade to hit my conscience. "You are trying to starve my unborn grandchild." My medical radar pinged immediately. It was a clumsy, pathetic lie. A fabricated pregnancy to shield a thief. It was the ultimate toxic boy-mom defense mechanism. When her son gets caught stealing, she turns him into the victim. "If you want to protect that imaginary child," I said coldly, "tell your son to put down my golf clubs, put on a pair of work boots, and get a job. He's cut off. Permanently." "You selfish, arrogant..." A sudden scuffle echoed through the speaker, the sound of a hand slapping plastic. A heavy sigh. Then a new voice came on the line. "You listen to me right now, little girl. Marcus Vance." His voice was thick, dripping with the unearned authority of a man who spent his entire life bullying his wife and son into submission. He always smelled like cheap cigars and entitlement. He thought because he sat at the head of a dining room table, the world owed him obedience. "This family does not air its dirty laundry in public," Marcus growled. The satellite delay made his heavy breathing sound like a cornered animal. Julian made a foolish mistake. Men get bored when their wives are never home. But we do not involve the government in our private affairs. I tightened my grip on the phone. The plastic cracked faintly under the pressure of my fingers. "I am ordering you to call the bank," Marcus continued, his tone turning into a hard patriarchal command. "Lift that freeze. Drop whatever legal nonsense you just started. You are embarrassing the Vance name. You are making us look bad." The last shred of tolerance I had for the Vance bloodline turned to ash, right there in the dirt. These people did not care that I was sleeping in a combat zone. They did not care that their son faked the death of my dog to torture me. They only cared that the neighbors might find out their son was a fraud who could not pay his own bills. I locked my jaw. I let the silence stretch for 3 heavy seconds. "Marcus," I said. I pushed every syllable through the receiver like a sniper round piercing glass. "Your honor was destroyed the second you raised a thief. Not by me. My duty is to the United States Army. I take my orders from the Pentagon, Marcus, not from a pathetic old man trying to cover up his son's crimes. You listen here, you ungrateful." "No, you listen." I cut him off, my voice turning to ice. "I will see you, your son, and anyone else who tries to hide his stolen money in a federal courtroom. Get a good lawyer. You are going to need one." I pulled the phone away from my ear. I pressed the red button. The line went dead. I tapped the screen, opened the contact list, and permanently blocked the number. The Vance family was officially shut out of my airspace. I turned around the heavy canvas door of the Jag tent, scraping against my shoulder as I walked back inside. The air conditioning rattled loudly. Major Grant was still sitting behind her wooden desk, her eyes fixed on the glowing computer monitor. She looked up at me. She did not ask who was on the phone. She already knew. I gave her a single sharp nod. "They took the bait," I said quietly. Grant's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "All right then, Captain," she murmured, a ruthless edge creeping into her voice. "Let's burn their house down." I turned my back to the canvas door of the tent. I looked directly at Major Grant. She was sitting in the dim glow of her computer monitor, waiting for the order. "It is time, Major," I said. My voice sounded hollow, stripped of everything except cold intent. "Full broadside, burn their world down." Grant did not smile. She just gave a sharp single nod and began striking her keyboard. The heavy plastic clacking filled the small room. I sat down at the opposite desk and flipped my laptop open. I booted up a secure encrypted video link. 3 seconds later, the screen flickered to life. Diana Lynn sat in her high-rise office in downtown Nashville. She was a civilian divorce attorney with a reputation for ripping aggressive husbands apart on the witness stand. We had established a 2-pronged legal trap. The military would freeze his present, Diana would choke out his past. "The asset freeze is live, Diana," I said. "I know," Diana replied. She leaned forward, adjusting her silver glasses. "I already have the confirmation from the regional bank manager. Julian Vance has exactly $0.00 in available credit. But that is not why I'm calling you, Nola. Check your secure inbox. You need to see what I just received." I clicked the flashing icon on my screen. A video file loaded. "Mrs. Higgins from next door sent this to me an hour ago," Diana said. "She has a night vision security camera pointed at her driveway. It catches a wide angle of your property line." I hit play. The footage was grainy, painted in the eerie, glowing green and black contrast of infrared night vision. There was Julian. He was backing a rented moving truck up to my front porch. The timestamp read 0200 hours. 2 in the morning. I watched the man I married drag a heavy upright wooden piano out the front door. He shoved it roughly up the metal ramp of the truck. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. That was not just furniture. That was my grandfather's piano. It was the only thing I had left of the man who raised me. Julian dragged it like it was a bag of garbage. Next, he came out carrying heavy cardboard boxes. The flaps were open. I recognized the thick spines of my medical residency textbooks. He walked past the moving truck and walked straight to the steel dumpster sitting on the curb. He hoisted the boxes up and dumped my books into the trash. He was not redecorating. He was not just clearing space for his new girlfriend. He was executing an erasure. He was surgically removing every physical trace that I ever existed in that house. He's liquidating your personal property for cash. Diana stated, her voice tight with professional anger. I am filing for an emergency injunction to lock the physical premises. I closed the video. Do it. 2 days passed. 48 hours of intense grinding trauma surgeries and hauling sandbags in the blistering Afghan heat. I was standing outside the medical supply tent drinking warm water from a plastic canteen. 50 feet away, the perimeter guard slapped a fresh magazine into his M4 rifle. The heavy metallic clack-clack of the bolt sliding forward echoed sharply in the dry air. My satellite phone vibrated in my tactical vest. It was Diana. Talk to me, I said, unscrewing the cap of my canteen. Nola. Diana's voice was wrong. In the 3 years I had known Diana Lynn, I had never heard her lose her composure. She was a steel wall. But right now her voice was shaking. What happened? I demanded. I dropped the canteen. Chloe called my office. Diana said, her breath hitching slightly. She is terrified. The landlord posted a 3-day eviction notice on the door. Julian has no money. He cannot pay for her car. He cannot pay for her food. She realized he is a fraud, and she is terrified of going to federal prison as an accomplice to financial abuse. So she flipped, I said, tracking a military transport truck kicking up dust in the distance. She wants to be a cooperating witness, Diana confirmed. She confessed everything. But Nola, there is a problem. Explain. She did not know you were married. Diana paused. I could hear her swallowing hard over the connection. She knew your name was on the house deed. She asked Julian about you when she moved in. But he did not tell her you were divorced. What did he tell her, Diana? He told her you were dead. The desert wind suddenly stopped blowing. He told her you were killed in action in Afghanistan 4 months ago. My knees gave out. The physical reaction was instant and violent. My legs simply stopped working. I collapsed downward, my combat boots sliding against the loose gravel. I threw my left arm out, slamming my bare hand onto the edge of a steel barricade to catch myself. The metal was baking in the 100-degree sun. It burned the skin off my palm, but I could not feel it. Killed in action. He did not just cheat on me. He did not just steal my money. He put me in an imaginary aluminum box. He draped an imaginary American flag over my coffin. He stood in my house looking into the eyes of a 22-year-old girl and played the role of the tragic, grieving widower. He used the ultimate sacrifice, a sacrifice my brothers and sisters were making in the dirt around me every single day, to get sympathy, to get sex, to justify stealing my house. He wished me dead so he could live comfortably. If you have ever had someone tell a vicious, unforgivable lie about you just so they could play the victim, hit the like button and subscribe right now. Drop a comment below and tell me the most ridiculous lie someone has ever spread about your life. Let us expose these cowards together. I pulled myself up from the barricade. I stared at my hand. It was red, blistered, and shaking. But the shaking was not from shock anymore. It was from a rage so pure, so absolute, that it felt like ice in my veins. This was no longer a civilian divorce, falsifying the death of an active-duty military officer to commit financial fraud. Identity theft of a deceased service member. He crossed the line from being a terrible husband to being a federal criminal. My grip failed. The heavy satellite phone slipped through my fingers and slammed against the dirt. I did not pick it up. I walked back into the command tent. Right as I stepped through the flap, the screen of my laptop flashed. A high-priority notification cut through the silence. It was an encrypted email. The sender address ended in @fbi.gov. I clicked the flashing icon. The screen went black for a split second before the encrypted message loaded. The sender address was clean, authoritative, and terrifying to anyone on the wrong side of the law. Sarah.Vega@FBI.gov. Special Agent Sarah Vega, White Collar Crime Division. I read the attached PDF. No emotion, just processing data. Julian had not just spent my hazard pay. He forged my signature. He took out a second mortgage on a house he did not legally own. He opened 5 different high-limit credit cards using my name and my social security number while I was deployed in a combat zone. $100,000. I leaned back in the folding metal chair. The sheer scale of the betrayal settled into my bones. He was not just funding his lifestyle. He was building a financial bomb. If I survived the rockets, the shrapnel, and the trauma ward, if I actually made it home, breathing that debt would have triggered a military background investigation. I would have lost my security clearance. I would have faced a court-martial. He built a trapdoor under my life, assuming I would never come back to find it. He weaponized my absence, but Chloe talked. The threat of a federal conspiracy charge broke her in less than 10 minutes. She handed the FBI every text message, every bank slip, every lie he told her. Wire fraud, identity theft of an active duty service member, federal offenses with mandatory minimum sentences. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was officially hunting. Diana Lynn called me 3 hours later. The satellite connection crackled, but the smug satisfaction in her voice was crystal clear. He is bleeding out, Nola, Diana said. Give me the casualty report. I replied, staring at a topographical map of the Afghan province pinned to the wall. He went to the ATM at a gas station on 8th Avenue. Card declined. He tried a credit card. Declined. Chloe threw her clothes into trash bags and bailed the second the FBI knocked on her door for a statement. She left him standing in an empty hallway. I pictured it. The fake entrepreneur stripped of my money, standing in a house owned by an irrevocable trust that just locked him out. No safety net, no rich mommy to bail him out because the federal government was watching the accounts. The designer suits and the craft bourbon facade peeled away. Underneath, he was just a broke, panicked parasite who ran out of blood to suck. Cowards do not stand their ground. When cornered, they run. According to the FBI surveillance log Agent Vega sent me later that night, Julian went into pure survival mode. He spent the afternoon frantically pawning off whatever electronics and watches he could carry. He managed to scrape together $10,000 in dirty cash. He stuffed the bills into a gym bag. He did not call his father. He did not call Sylvia. He hailed a cheap yellow cab and headed straight for the Greyhound bus station in downtown Nashville. He bought a one-way ticket to Miami, a cheap seat on a diesel-choked bus. He thought he could just slip across state lines and disappear into the humidity. He never even made it to the platform. The second email from Agent Vega came through at 0400 hours Afghan time. There was no text in the body of the message, just a single high-resolution JPEG attachment. I opened it. The photo was taken under the harsh yellow glow of the bus station parking lot lights. 3 black Chevy Tahoes had boxed in the bus. The tires were angled sharply, showing how violently they had slammed on the brakes to cut off his escape route. And right in the center of the frame was Julian Vance. He was not wearing his tailored golf polo. He was wearing a wrinkled, sweat-stained gray t-shirt. His face was shoved hard against the hot black metal hood of an FBI vehicle. His mouth was hanging open. His eyes were wide white and completely consumed by absolute terror. An agent had his knee planted firmly between Julian's shoulder blades, pinning him like an insect. The agent's hands were wrenching Julian's arms violently behind his back. The heavy steel of a pair of Smith & Wesson handcuffs was locked tight around his wrists. I could almost hear the sharp metallic ratcheting clicks through the photograph. I stared at the image. I looked at the man who had yelled at me, who had belittled my career, who had told his mistress I was dead in the dirt. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He was nothing but a federal inmate waiting for a number. I did not smile. I did not laugh. The surgery was simply complete. The tumor was successfully removed. I hit the print command on the laptop. The portable laser printer in the corner of the tent hummed, spitting out a crisp black and white copy of Julian pinned to the hood of that truck. I pulled the warm paper from the tray. I folded it once, clean and sharp. I tucked the photo into the breast pocket of my uniform, right over my heart. I grabbed my satellite phone off the desk and walked out of the tent heading straight toward the empty soundproofed communications bunker at the edge of the camp. I pushed the heavy steel door open. It shut behind me with a solid, airtight thud cutting off the noise of the base. I sat down at the metal table. The room was dead silent. I placed the phone in the center of the table. 10 seconds later, the screen lit up. It vibrated violently against the steel. The incoming number belonged to the Vance household. I reached out and picked it up. I picked up the satellite phone. The heavy plastic casing felt cold against my palm. The soundproof bunker swallowed all the ambient noise of the base, leaving only a dead, ringing silence in my ears. I hit the green button. I did not speak. For the first time in the 3 years I had known the Vance family, there was no arrogant greeting, no condescending sigh from Sylvia, no gruff patriarchal command from Marcus. There was only the wet, jagged sound of someone choking on their own snot. Nola. Sylvia's voice was completely broken. It sounded thin like a frayed wire ready to snap. Nola, please. I leaned back in the metal chair, staring at the blank steel wall opposite me. Diana Lynn had already forwarded me the court docket earlier that afternoon. Faced with a mountain of forged signatures, frozen assets, and a mistress who handed the FBI everything but his shoe size, Julian's public defender threw in the towel. There was no trial. No dramatic courtroom speech. Julian Vance took a plea deal to avoid the maximum sentence. 12 years in federal prison, 100% restitution of the stolen funds. And that divorce petition he filed just to scare me. Diana pushed it through the judge's desk the moment Julian signed his confession. The marriage was dead buried and paved over. Nola, you have to talk to your lawyers, Sylvia sobbed. The satellite static broke up her words, making her sound even more pathetic. Please, call them off. Tell the judge to reduce the sentence. He cannot survive in a federal penitentiary, Nola. He's not built for that. I listened to her cry. Not a single word of apology for what he did. Not a single acknowledgement of the money he stole, the lies he told, or the dog he tried to kill in my head. She only cared about the pain hitting her own front door. He is just a boy, Nola. Sylvia pleaded, her voice dropping into a desperate, wretched whisper. I am begging you, as a mother. Have some mercy. Mercy. I felt the folded piece of paper resting in the breast pocket of my uniform. The picture of Julian pinned to the hood of that Chevy Tahoe, a coward caught in the headlights. Mercy, I repeated. The word tasted like copper in my mouth. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold metal table. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with the precise mechanical rhythm of a surgeon cutting through dead tissue. He was my husband when he called me sobbing, telling me my dog's skull had been crushed under a tire. I said, Nola, he was just confused. He was my husband. I cut her off, my voice dropping an octave, when he drained $38,000 of combat hazard pay so he could buy cheap liquor for a girl he moved into my house. Sylvia let out a loud, ragged sob. I ignored it. And he was my husband when he looked that same girl in the eye and told her I had been killed in action in the Afghan dirt. I let the silence stretch. I let the weight of that last sentence press down on her chest from 7,000 miles away. He dug that hole with his own 2 hands, Sylvia, I stated. I am just the one who finally threw the dirt on top of him. You are a monster. The grief vanished, replaced instantly by the ugly defensive venom that had always been hiding just beneath her surface. You are a cold, heartless bitch. You are destroying our family over a mistake. I did not flinch. The venom did not burn anymore. It just sounded like noise. I am a captain in the United States Army. I corrected her, keeping my tone absolutely flat. My family is out here bleeding in the sand to protect the freedom your son used to commit federal wire fraud. I stood up from the metal chair. The scrape of the legs against the concrete floor echoed sharply in the bunker. Julian made his choices. I said, my voice hardening into a final, undeniable verdict. But right now, Julian is a federal inmate, and I do not stay married to federal inmates. Nola! I pulled the phone away from my ear. I stared at the red button on the keypad. I pressed it down with my thumb. The line went dead with a sharp, piercing beep. I did not stop there. I accessed the internal settings, selected the number, and hit block contact. I set the heavy plastic phone down in the dead center of the metal table. It was over. The surgical removal of the Vance family was complete. The tumor was cut out, the margins were clean, and the bleeding was stopped. I expected to feel a massive rush of adrenaline. I expected to feel the kind of explosive victory you see in movies. Instead, there was just an immense ringing emptiness in my chest. I pushed the heavy steel door open and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat hit me instantly, dry and suffocating. I walked back toward the barracks, the gravel crunching under my boots. No one was shooting. The medevac choppers were grounded. For the first time in weeks, the base was quiet. 3 days later, I was sitting on an empty ammunition crate outside the medical tent, staring at the jagged brown silhouette of the Hindu Kush Mountains. A shadow fell over me. I looked up. It was Private Harris, the 19-year-old kid who ran the mail distribution for the forward operating base. He was covered in dust, holding a small brown cardboard box sealed with heavy clear tape. He held it out to me. "Mail call, Captain," Harris said, wiping sweat off his forehead. "Just came in on the C-17 from Bagram." I looked at the return address stamped in black ink on the top left corner. It was from Tennessee. But it was not from Julian. And it was not from the lawyers. I stared at the return address. Maya. Maya was not blood. She was a trauma nurse I met during my second year of residency. She was the one who kicked the front door of my house wide open the second Diana Lynn secured the eviction order. While Julian was running for the Greyhound bus station, Maya had marched straight past. His crying, panicked mistress grabbed Buster by his collar and loaded him into her truck. I took the small cardboard package from Private Harris. The box felt incredibly light in my hands. "Thanks, Harris," I muttered, my voice sounding rough and unused. He gave a quick nod and jogged back toward the supply trucks. I sat back down on the empty steel ammunition crate. A week had passed since Julian signed his plea deal. A full week since the judge stamped the divorce decree and sentenced him to 12 years. The money was back in my shadow account. The enemy was destroyed. The threat was neutralized. By every logical metric, I was supposed to feel victorious. But I didn't. I just felt hollow. My chest felt like a damp, empty concrete vault. For months, I had worn a suit of psychological armor just to survive this deployment. I locked my emotions away behind steel blast doors so I could keep operating on shattered soldiers while my husband tried to bury me alive. Now the war was over. But the armor was still bolted to my skin. It was suffocating me. I felt like I could not pull a full breath of air into my lungs. I reached down to my tactical belt and pulled out my combat knife. The black steel blade was scarred from opening ration crates and cutting zip ties. I wedged the tip under the heavy clear packing tape on the box. Ripe! The sharp tearing sound of the adhesive giving way cut through the quiet desert air. I flipped the cardboard flaps open. There was no bubble wrap, no letters, no care package snacks, just a single thick white envelope resting at the bottom. I pulled it out. The paper felt clean and thick, completely out of place against the grit and dirt covering my hands. I slid my thumb under the seal and pulled out a folded white greeting card. I opened it, and right then the axis of the earth stopped spinning. Smack in the center of the crisp white paper was a small, perfectly pressed black ink stamp. It was a dog's paw print. Below the black ink, Maya had scrawled a few lines in her messy handwriting. "Hey, Mom, I miss you. I wait by the front door for you every night. Love, Buster." I stared at the black ink. Julian had used this animal to break me. He weaponized a dog to manipulate my grief. He subjected me to months of agonizing, suffocating mourning for a creature that was alive and sleeping on my own living room rug. He fed me a diet of pure, toxic lies to mask his own greed. But looking at this paw print, it was real. In a world entirely corrupted by the greed of a narcissistic husband, the enabling toxicity of his parents, and the casual cruelty of people who claimed to love me, this small black paw print was the only honest thing left. It represented a pure, unfiltered loyalty that no human in the Vance family was capable of understanding. My throat closed up. A sharp, burning ache clamped down on my windpipe. The heavy steel armor I had worn for months finally cracked. My vision blurred. A hot tear spilled over my lower lash line, cutting a clean track through the dust on my cheek. Then another. And another. I dropped my head down to my knees, clutching the white card in both hands, and I finally broke. I did not just cry, I sobbed. The ugly, violent, body-shaking kind of crying that I had denied myself since the day I received that first email. I cried for the betrayal. I cried for the exhaustion. I cried for the sheer, terrifying weight of having to protect myself from the people who were supposed to be my family. The sound of my own ragged breathing echoed against the metal sides of the ammunition crate. I sat alone in the dirt of a foreign country, surrounded by barbed wire, crying over a paw print from a dog who did not even know how to speak, but who loved me more than the man I married. I let it all out. I let the poison bleed out of the wound until there was nothing left but clear water. The next morning, the Afghan sun crested over the Hindu Kush mountains, casting a long, sharp shadow across the base. My eyes were red and swollen. My throat felt like sandpaper. But as I strapped my tactical vest over my chest, I realized something. The heavy, suffocating pressure in my lungs was gone. The vault was open. I could breathe again. I walked over to my footlocker and pulled out my green military logbook. I clicked my pen and stared at the lined paper. Julian getting 12 years in a federal penitentiary was not my revenge. Taking the house back was not my revenge. I pressed the pen to the paper and wrote a single line. My revenge is my peace. I shut the book. I picked up the satellite phone and dialed a domestic number. It rang 3 times before a woman with a thick southern drawl answered. Tennessee Beagle Rescue. How can I help you? Hi, I said. My voice was steady. My friend Maya came by yesterday to look at a rescue dog, a scrawny female with a scar over her left eye. Oh yes, the little stray. She's been having a hard time adjusting. I want her, I said firmly. Email me the adoption paperwork. Maya will pick her up this afternoon. That is wonderful, the woman said. Do you have a name for her yet? I looked out through the tent flap at the American flag, snapping violently in the desert wind. Liberty, I said. Liberty, the woman repeated softly. I like that. Are you sure you are ready for a new dog, ma'am? I grabbed my assault pack and slung it over my shoulder. I am ready to go home. Screech! The heavy rubber tires of the C-17 military transport plane hit the Nashville tarmac hard. The massive aircraft rattled the engine thrust, reversing with a deafening roar that shook my teeth. I sat strapped into the red webbing of the jump seat, staring straight ahead. 3 months ago, I was standing in a dust-choked medical tent, looking at a picture of another woman wearing my clothes. I was a betrayed wife, a target, a walking paycheck for a family of parasites. Now the cargo ramp lowered, letting the thick, humid Tennessee air flood the cabin. I unbuckled my harness and grabbed my assault pack. I walked down the ramp and put my boots on American concrete. I was a free woman. My older sister Clara was waiting at the chain-link fence by the terminal. She did not say a word. She just grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me into a crushingly tight hug. She smelled like cheap laundry detergent and home. Get in the truck, Clara said, taking my heavy green duffel bag. We have a stop to make. 10 minutes later, Clara threw the truck into park in front of Maya's townhouse. I did not even make it to the porch. The front door banged open. A brown, black, and white torpedo launched off the top step. Buster. He hit my chest so hard he nearly knocked me backward onto the concrete walkway. He scrambled up my uniform, whining, crying, and twisting his body into violent, uncontrollable shapes of pure joy. His tail whipped against my leg like a metronome set to overdrive. I dropped to my knees on the hot sidewalk. I buried my face deep into the thick, soft fur on his neck. He smelled like dog shampoo and corn chips. It was the best thing I had ever smelled in my life. He aggressively licked the salt and sweat off my cheek. I am home, buddy, I whispered into his ear. Mom is home. An hour later, I drove my truck down my own street. I parked in the driveway. I walked up to the front door, slid my key into the deadbolt, and pushed it open. Buster trotted in right beside me. The house was quiet. It smelled stale. Julian's mistress had left a cheap floral perfume lingering in the air. but the house itself was empty. I walked into the living room. Right in the center, sitting on the rug, was the heavy dark oak coffee table. This was the table from the photograph, the table where she propped her bare feet while wearing my silk robe. Julian thought he had ruined this house for me. He thought the betrayal would taint the walls so badly that I would have to sell it. I walked into the kitchen. I grabbed a spray bottle of heavy-duty degreaser and a rough shop towel. I walked back to the oak table. I sprayed the wood. I wiped it down. I dug my nails into the towel and scrubbed the grain until the wood gleamed under the ceiling lights. I was not throwing this table away. I paid for this table with 3 months of night shifts. I bought this house with hazard pay and missing sleep. This house did not belong to a cheater. It did not belong to the Vance family. It was mine. And the table was no longer a crime scene. It was a monument to the war I fought and the war I won. The next morning, Maya drove me to the rescue shelter. I signed the final paperwork and walked out with a skinny, nervous beagle mix who had a jagged scar over her left eye. She kept her head down, tail tucked between her legs. I put her in the passenger seat. I rubbed her ears. "It is okay, Liberty," I said quietly. "Nobody is going to hurt you anymore." 1 month later. The thick, heavy smell of hickory smoke and roasting brisket drifted over the wooden fence of my backyard. The summer sun was dropping low, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and bruised purple. I stood on the back patio, holding an ice-cold can of domestic beer. The condensation dripped over my knuckles. I looked at my yard. Clara was arguing loudly with Maya about college football. Mrs. Higgins, the widow from next door, who provided the security footage, was setting down a massive bowl of her famous jalapeno potato salad on the picnic table. Diana Lynn, my divorce attorney, was sitting in a lawn chair laughing out loud. And standing over the grill holding a pair of steel tongs was Sergeant Miller. He took 2 weeks of leave and flew straight to Tennessee. Not a single person in this yard shared my last name. There was no Marcus demanding respect. There was no Sylvia serving fake smiles. I raised my beer, taking a long, cold swallow. Family is not a marriage certificate. Family is not a shared bloodline. Family is the people who stand in front of the door with a shotgun when the wolves come scratching. I built a fortress, and I filled it with people who earned their place at the table. The screen door banged shut. I walked into the kitchen, setting my empty can on the counter. The house was loud. Buster and Liberty were chasing each other in circles on the hardwood floor, their claws clicking wildly against the wood. I grabbed a glass of iced sweet tea and walked over to the kitchen island. I popped open my laptop to check my civilian email. There was a new message at the top of the inbox. The subject line read, "Major Grant told me to contact you." I clicked it. It was from a 24-year-old second lieutenant stationed in Texas. She was engaged to a civilian guy. She explained that she noticed money disappearing from her accounts while she was on field training exercises. He told her she was crazy. He told her she just lost track of her spending. She was scared, confused, and felt like she was losing her mind. I stared at the screen. The ice clinked softly against the glass in my hand. Julian Vance caused the explosion in my life, but he did not get to write the ending. He did not get to decide my legacy. I did. I set the glass down. I put my fingers on the keyboard. I typed, "Dear Lieutenant. Thank you for reaching out."